All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Optispan podcast. Today, we're going to talk about rapamycin. It's pretty interesting. There was an article that came out in the New York Times a little more than a week ago now, I think, focused on rapamycin. And so it seemed like an obvious thing for us to talk about. I don't know exactly how I feel about this article. I mean, I think it was, my sort of take home is the article was pretty well written. It was definitely, I think, if anything, undersold the potential of rapamycin. And then some of the comments I thought, as is always going to be the case, were just a little bit like disappointing and not very well thought out. The title was Anti-Aging Enthusiasts Are Taking a Pill to Extend Their Lives. Will it work? But having said that, it definitely, I think, increased the profile of rapamycin maybe more than it has been recently. And you know, again, I have mixed feelings about that. Like, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't know. The attention for the field is probably good, especially when presented in this sort of a understated way, as opposed to overhyped. But also, you know, I think there's some downsides that go along with the sort of raising rapamycin to this level of attention before we actually know to what extent does it work in humans to slow aging.
Yep. Well, I read the New York Times article and I got put together a few questions for you.
Okay.
They did shout out Optispan, which is super cool seeing your job there. So there are a few mentions in the article about sort of feeling Rapa, or it's hard to tell if it's placebo or not. So I've never taken it. Is it something you're even supposed to feel? It's not like a stimulant like caffeine.
No, absolutely not. And so here's my thinking. So again, I think anybody who's being honest, right, has to admit that if you take anything, I mean, it's not unique to rapamycin. If you take any drug and all of a sudden you feel something, good or bad, it could be a real effect of the drug or it could be a placebo effect, right? Your psychological impact of, you're taking the drug and it causes you to perceive something or even has a biological effect on you. That's real. So I think that this idea that, can we prove it's the rapamycin? That's just being honest. It could be a placebo. So feeling Rapa is interesting. And here's my perception. Again, I can't back this up with, rigorously controlled clinical trial data. This is just from my own experience and talking to people. I think the most commonly reported things that people feel that I think are probably real are all related to chronic inflammation. So I've talked before about the first time I ever took rapamycin. It's because I had inflammation of the shoulder capsule, extremely painful, very limited range of motion. I knew rapamycin had effects on age-related inflammation. I took it for a few weeks and I felt a lot better. That could be placebo. I don't think it was. Biologically, that makes sense, given how we know rapamycin works. And that's my experience in talking to people. I think people who have high burden of chronic, especially what we would call sterile inflammation, so this is autoimmune kinds of things that go up with age, have lots of aches and pains because of that chronic inflammation. Sometimes, this sort of even like chronic pain syndrome or chronic fatigue. I think a lot of the symptoms of long COVID come from this sort of inflammation. People who just kind of feel like crap because they have a lot of inflammation, they take a drug that knocks down that inflammation very potently. And again, not every anti-inflammatory is going to do this, right? There are different types of inflammation, and Rapa, for, again, reasons that aren't completely clear, seems very good at blunting this age-related sterile inflammation. In fact, John Berner and I talked in some detail about how this might be working, both at the level of microglia in the brain and macrophages in other parts of the body. So for people who are interested, can tune into that. But I think that's the Rapa feeling that some people feel. They've got a high burden of chronic inflammation. Rapa knocks it down, and you just feel better. You don't have the chronic aches and pains. You don't have as much fatigue. And I think that's what people are referring to. But I can't prove that's what's going on.
So anything you'd feel with placebo, it would be health span metrics. Because, of course, you couldn't have a placebo for lifespan metrics. They're talking about living longer.
Well, again, I think you could, right? So we know that the placebo effect actually can have real biological impacts. Like, I don't think you would, but is it possible that if you thought you were taking something that slowed biological aging, that that your brain could send out signals to the rest of your body that would slow biological aging. Yeah, it's absolutely possible.
Oh, it's
Right?
fascinating.
Or even just an indirect way. Maybe you think you're taking a drug that's really going to make you healthier, and that actually reduces your chronic stress burden psychologically. That has a positive impact on biological aging. So yeah, I think it is possible that
Well,
there could be a placebo effect
yeah.
that impacts biological aging.
All right, so there's a quote from Dr. Dillon in the article I wanted to read to you and get your opinion on. So it's, let's see, taking something that's risky, that's going to have no benefits, dot, 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 I'll pass.
Yeah, I mean, this was the very last, I think, line in the article, and it was kind of disappointing to me for a couple of reasons. Again, I get this mentality, like I totally get it. I think it's a mistake for people to approach not just rapamycin, but the idea that there may be something that you can do to improve your health, but you're not going to do it because you don't know if it's for sure if it's going to work or not. Again, everything should be a risk reward, right? So the thing that disappointed me about this, and Andy Dillon's a good scientist. He doesn't know much about rapamycin, so he probably shouldn't have been talking in this article, in my view. But this is kind of disappointing because it sort of implies that he knows it's risky. He doesn't really know what the risks are. He might have heard rapamycin's a risky drug, but he doesn't actually know how risky it is. But let's accept that it's risky. Then he says that's going to have no benefits. He has no idea whether it's going to have benefits, right?
Yeah.
So the implication here is that it's a really risky drug that he knows is going to have no benefits. Well, sure. If that was the case, of course you wouldn't do it. If you knew it didn't have any benefits and there was risk, obviously the risk reward goes to risk, but that's all not true. That's, I think, the disappointing part of this. So I will hope and give Andy the benefit of the doubt that this was kind of taken out of context. But if that's what he really said, and this is in context, it was just a dumb thing to say.
So the New York Times article talked about mixed results in human studies. You know what mixed results they're referring to?
No, and again, this is where I think we have to be careful about the historical use of rapamycin as an organ transplant drug and other derivatives of rapamycin versus the way people are using it now in what we call off-label prescribed by their doctors, but not for organ transplant, right? To potentially have an impact on health span and lifespan. So there are certainly studies of rapamycin that have been done at very high doses for other indications that gave mixed results. Some significant side effects, some benefits for like organ transplant rejection. I'm not aware of any what I would consider truly mixed results in the studies looking at doses of rapamycin that are used off label. I would say it's important to appreciate most of the studies that have happened or are happening now are tiny. Like, there have been studies of 10 people taking rapamycin off label. And sure, they didn't see any positive results because they didn't, first of all, look, and they're statistically not powered to see anything, even if they did look. So is that a mixed result? No, it's just that's not what the study was designed to do. So I don't really, it makes it sound like there have been a bunch of studies and some of them didn't see any benefits and some of them did, and some of them saw side effects and some of them didn't. I don't think that's really the situation. I don't think there has been any well-powered clinical trial that did not see a positive effect from rapamycin. And I think there are several studies that have been suggestive, right? But nothing definitive. So again, I think it's fair to say we don't know at this point which endpoints is rapamycin likely to be beneficial for in the context of longevity or health span, because we don't have the clinical trial data. But the anecdotal data, the collection for people using off-label, I would say for some things, the arrows are pointing in the right direction. Like I talked about, these sort of chronic inflammatory disorders, heart function in dogs and cats, and case reports in people with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So I think there are lots of arrows pointing in the right direction for certain things. I don't think it's really the case that there's mixed results. I think most of the results have been pretty positive, both in terms of safety and in terms of evidence for efficacy, although not definitive.
I know I want to get your opinion on this. I know one person, whenever I bring up rapamycin, he goes straight to, oh, that makes you infertile as a guy. And this is something I don't know where he got that from. And I wanted to get your sort of opinion on that.
So the data in mice is pretty clear that rapamycin, the doses of rapamycin that have been used to increase lifespan in mice do cause defects in spermatogenesis. And so that may be where it's coming from. I don't know of any human data. It may exist, and this is certainly testable. I mean, it's interesting. I actually don't know if anybody has done sort of sperm quality analysis on people using rapamycin off-label. I will say most of the people who are using rapamycin off-label are not trying to have children. And again, just from a sort of common sense perspective, I would suggest if you are trying to have children, you probably shouldn't be taking rapamycin. To the best of my knowledge, all of the effects of rapamycin like that in people are transient in the sense that if you stop taking the drug, the side effects go away. I don't know for sure if that would be true for this defect in spermatogenesis, but I would guess if there was a young person taking rapamycin and they had reduced sperm quality and they stopped taking the drug, that probably would, the sperm quality would probably come back. So in other words, it's not like what we hear about, young people who abuse anabolic steroids then have trouble regaining testosterone levels. Those side effects seems to go away with rapamycin. And I don't know of any studies reporting that organ transplant patients on rapamycin are infertile. So I would guess it's probably not that it makes you sterile, but it certainly could affect sperm quality.
All right, so 2 parts for my next question. So they mentioned side effects. They mentioned it could affect your cholesterol profile and it could decrease your insulin sensitivity. And my sort of follow-up on that, if it does affect your cholesterol, do we know if it's HDL, LDL, a mix of the two?
Yeah. Okay. So again, this is a place where the data from organ transplant patients and the data from mice sometimes get all jumbled up and confused. So it is the case in organ transplant patients taking rapamycin at high doses daily that some people show increased blood lipids. So that's the increased cholesterol, HDL, LDL. And some people show insulin resistance. So it's called like a pseudo-diabetes. Not everybody, but it is a subset of patients taking those doses. In mice, I don't think the data is compelling that rapamycin significantly increases blood lipids, the doses that increase lifespan, or significantly impacts insulin resistance or blood glucose levels on a normal diet. What you do see is if you give the mice getting rapamycin a glucose tolerance test. So basically it's done by giving them a high amount of glucose, non-physiological. Like they would never experience this amount of glucose in their day-to-day life. You hit them with a high amount of glucose, you do see a delayed clearance of that glucose in that context. So I think what rapamycin is doing there is it's changing sort of the metabolic homeostasis so that when you hit them with this non-physiological amount of glucose, they metabolize it differently. Is that really a deficit? Unclear. The mice are living longer. They don't have higher A1C. They don't really have higher fasting glucose. So probably not a bad thing in that context. I'm not aware of any convincing data that off-label use of rapamycin significantly impacts blood lipids or insulin sensitivity or fasting glucose across the population. Certainly in some people it may. I can tell you from our studies in dogs, we have had one dog at the dose of rapamycin that's being tested in our clinical trial develop high triglycerides. Only one, and it went away when the dog finished the study. So it seemed to be reversible. So my guess is there may be a small subset of people who, based on genetics or something else about their environment, where you might see these kinds of changes. And so my advice would be you should probably be getting these blood tests done regularly anyway. But if you're not and you're taking rapamycin, definitely get these done maybe once every 3 months. If you see hypertriglyceridemia, then maybe you come off the rapamycin, try a different dose, right? But I think it's easy to monitor. I personally am not worried about it.
Yeah, and that's the same advice you'd give if someone's taking finasteride, statins.
Yeah, again, you should be doing it anyway.
Yeah.
But especially if you're taking a drug off-label, you should be getting your biomarkers monitored.
Great. All right, next question. Are there significant differences in how rapamycin affects humans compared to animals?
So I'm going to parse this a little bit and say, at a macro level, no. Rapamycin inhibits mTOR complex 1 in every organism where it's been tested. So biochemically, no. In terms of the consequences of that inhibition of mTOR complex 1, yeah, there are differences in different animals, particularly when you get in mammals. That's kind of different from what we see in C. elegans or in yeast cells. a mammal that has a sort of sophisticated immune system, it that's where rapamycin has many of its potent effects. So they're going to be somewhat different there. When we think about going from mice to people to dogs, I'm sure there are differences, but I would say the similarities probably greatly outweigh the differences in that context. And so I think, especially when we're looking at the impact on biological aging, so far, everything I've seen makes me believe that rapamycin is working pretty much the same way in mice and dogs and people in terms of its impact on the biological aging process. But again, that's a pretty limited data set, so I don't know for sure. But in general, I think in that context, the effects are pretty similar.
The article mentioned the relationship between like some potential benefits between rapamycin and Alzheimer's. Have you heard of anything like that before?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a large body of literature in rodents, mice in particular, showing that rapamycin can prevent, or in some cases, even reverse cognitive decline and molecular features of Alzheimer's disease in pretty much every Alzheimer's disease model that there is in rodents. And then also in normally aging rodents can prevent cognitive decline.
Mm.
And so this is actually one of the use cases that many of the people who are taking rapamycin off label, they're taking it because they know genetically they're at a higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. In particular, many people who have the ApoE4 allele take rapamycin because that puts them at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. We don't have any data in humans yet. And, this is a bit of a source of frustration. So Veronica Galvin and I, a decade ago now, wrote a paper arguing that, there really should be dedicated clinical trials of rapamycin for Alzheimer's disease and probably other dementias as well. And the Alzheimer's disease community has just failed miserably to act on it. So it's unfortunate. It makes me angry. I feel particularly sorry for the families of patients with Alzheimer's disease that clinical trial wasn't done 15 years ago, still hasn't been done.
So if someone in your life you knew, say 50 plus, they had one or two ApoE4 variants, you probably would recommend, more
I
likely to
certainly would
recommend.
talk to them about it. Yeah. In particular, if they had other biomarkers, other factors that were suggesting that they were headed down the path. Yes. If it was me personally, I mean, obviously,
Yeah,
I already do take rapamycin, but yeah, if it was somebody I loved, I would certainly have that conversation. Again, obviously, it's an individual choice, and we don't know whether rapamycin is going to have a significant impact. But I think the preponderance of evidence suggests that it certainly could.
Okay, so certain genes could make someone a better candidate for rapamycin. Does it go the opposite way, where if somebody has a certain gene, it makes you less likely to recommend it?
I can't think of any specific cases. Again, the preclinical literature and laboratory animals, there are very few examples where rapamycin, in the context that we're talking about, its off-label use, has any detrimental effects. So I can't think of any. I'm sure there are. I just don't think we have any data
Yeah.
on any specific genetic variants that would be potentially have a negative outcome in combination with rapamycin.
Okay. So if someone were to come to you and they want to take rapamycin off label for protective reasonings, what sort of precautions would you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, again, not medical advice, but I think the things that I would immediately think about are dose. So people want to know what's the right dose. The answer is we don't know. Most people are taking rapamycin once a week. I think that makes sense as opposed to the daily dosing. I think there's some reason to believe the risk of side effects, particularly things like the lipid changes we talked about, or also potentially increased risk of infection, tend to go away at the weekly dosing and may actually get better. So I think weekly dosing makes sense given what we know now. 6 milligrams a week is the most common dose. Again, that makes sense in the absence of other data. So that's where I would think about landing there. And, if you experience side effects, mouth sores being the most likely, back off or stop taking it for a while. The mouth sores will go away. Try it again and see if they come back. For some people, they don't. We don't really understand why. Once you start taking rapamycin, here's the other thing I would say. I would recommend getting blood work done before And quarterly probably is reasonable while you're taking rapamycin. And just make sure, none of the biomarkers that we typically would think about measuring get out of the desired range after you start rapamycin. Hopefully things will get better. Again, people then will ask, well, what do I measure? You can measure everything. So it depends a little bit on how much you want to spend, but I would certainly look at, the basics, right? So we're talking about blood glucose. I would get insulin measured. So fasting glucose, fasting insulin, A1C, general CBC chem. You want to know what the cell counts look like, blood cells, kidney, liver function, lipids, right? So that's the other place you'd want to look. And just as we already talked about, make sure your lipids aren't going outside of the desired range or going in the wrong direction. Then if you want to go beyond that, I would start thinking about looking at things like comprehensive hormones. There's no point in doing testosterone alone, but comprehensive hormones, by that I mean just total testosterone. It just doesn't, it means nothing. I'm sorry. You need to actually know what the free testosterone looks like. And I would argue what the other hormones look like as well. So if you want to look at hormones, that makes sense. I don't have any reason to think that rapamycin use off-label changes hormones, so I'm not too concerned about that. Inflammatory markers, so there are autoimmune markers, other markers of inflammation that might be useful to see whether or not rapamycin is having an impact on your inflammatory status. Those are things I would think about. If you want to look at a biological age test, fine. Again, we've talked about that. I don't have a lot of faith in the epigenetic tests. And so it wouldn't change anything in my view. No matter what result you got, if you did that, I wouldn't change what I was doing based on that. So I don't see any point in doing that. I think the immune senescence test that we've talked about on the podcast previously when I interviewed Natalia Mitten from Sapir is potentially a useful test for both predicting people who might be good candidates for rapamycin and efficacy for rapamycin in that context of immune function and immune senescence. That test is not available outside of a very small number of clinics. So you probably wouldn't be able to get access to that test. But that's another thing that I think is interesting to look at. Body composition. So the Pearl trial just released results suggesting that at very low doses, even in women, rapamycin may have positive effects on lean mass. So I would think about getting a DEXA, every 3 to 6 months while taking rapamycin. Those are the things I would think about right off the top of my head.
Is there any relationship between C-reactive protein that you might get on like your normal blood panel and taking rapamycin?
Possibly. Again, I'm not aware of any clear effects of off-label use of rapamycin on C-reactive protein levels. The one thing I think it is maybe worth saying is there have been a few sort of anecdotal reports of people who see an increase in some inflammatory markers when they start taking rapamycin off-label. My intuition is these are often people who are taking like 1 milligrams a day rather than 6 milligrams a week. But that's worth looking at. Like if you see things going in the wrong direction, you may be somebody that rapamycin is not a good choice for. And I wouldn't say keep taking it if you're seeing biomarkers go in the wrong direction.
You kind of have a fork in the road. You either stop it or you try to take something else to fix maybe the bad lipids or the bad blood sugar, like a PCSK9 inhibitor.
Yeah,
metformin.
It's interesting. I mean, people talk about like, should I combine rapamycin with metformin to offset if rapamycin is going to have effects on insulin resistance, offset that. Again, maybe, I don't know. I mean, my opinion here is not strong, and you may get a different answer a year from now, depending on what additional data comes out. I guess my gut reaction is that if rapamycin is causing a side effect that requires you to take another medication to offset that side effect, I don't know that we know yet strongly enough that what the benefits of rapamycin are that I would recommend that. Having said that, if you have, a high inflammatory burden, you start taking rapamycin, you suddenly feel just a ton better. Like you really feel like it's made a positive difference, but your lipids go in the wrong direction, then yeah, maybe take a statin along with rapamycin to offset that. Again, I don't know of anybody that falls into that category, but maybe that would be a case where it would make sense to take a second medication to to offset a potential side effect of rapamycin. The metformin case is complicated, obviously, because some people believe that metformin has effects on aging in and of itself. So maybe there are benefits to combining the two for a different reason. But that's not what I was talking about there.
Yeah. I don't mean to always bring it back to this. It's just what I know. But like I know like people who abuse steroids and stuff, it's like your testosterone goes high, then your estrogen goes high. So they'll take something to lower the estrogen.
Right.
And now your lipids are out of control. So it's a lot of like you start to stack. You create a stack to have a more well-rounded blood work.
Right.
Because you still want the benefits from that high testosterone.
Right. And again, the thing to appreciate is every drug is going to have off-target or unexpected effects. So when you start to stack, the complexity of the biological effects that you're having increases dramatically. And I think the likelihood of having unanticipated consequences increases dramatically. And as I've alluded to previously, in any complicated system, any complicated machine, if you start just randomly changing things, the likelihood you're going to make it better is far less than the likelihood you're going to make it worse.
So ideally, you don't have to take more than just a couple things. Or
ideally, you want to be very targeted in anything you do and understand what it is you're trying to accomplish, why you're trying to accomplish it, and have a, relatively high degree of confidence that that's actually a good thing.
Yeah. Okay. So it's kind of an open-ended question to end on, but like, again, what research do you think is really missing? Like, what would you like to see happen in the field so we can see how geroprotective rapamycin is?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think what's honestly really missing are just the good clinical trials, right? We need, well, I don't know if we need it. We would be well served as a community to have well-powered, randomized clinical trials with a placebo group, double-blind, for multiple age-related endpoints to know where is rapamycin effective and where isn't it effective. And that's all doable. And it's not obscenely expensive. There just has not yet been a will to fund those trials. I think a longevity trial, that's kind of off the table. But there are a bunch of age-related endpoints where there's enough anecdotal data now to suggest that rapamycin may have benefits there, that this could be done, and it just hasn't been. And I think the sort of associated point to make there is the clinical trials that are happening now, while it's a good thing that these clinical trials are happening, and I think the article mentioned a couple, none of them are powered for efficacy. What I mean by that is the sample size is too small to have a high degree of confidence that even if there's a benefit, that we'll be able to detect it. They are really designed as safety trials. And so I understand the reasons why. I'm not being critical of the investigators at all. It's because of the amount of funding that's available. But what ends up happening, and this is a broader problem in the geroscience clinical trial community in general, what ends up happening is we have all of these underpowered clinical trials that take a couple of years to complete. And at the end of the day, we get a result that's like, well, maybe it works, but it's safe. So I need another grant to do another underpowered clinical trial. And that's why it takes, 5-10 years to get to the point where you actually get a well-powered clinical trial. And sometimes the well-powered clinical trials never happen. This is rampant in the supplement. So if a supplement company even does a clinical trial, they're underpowered. And you never get an answer. And so, I think that's what we really need is we need clinical trials designed to really answer the important questions. Rapamycin is safe. We know that now. It's freaking FDA approved. It had to pass the safety standards for human use, even in organ transplant patients. At the doses people are using off-label, it's safe. Is it 100% no side effects? Of course not. No drug has that. But it's safe. We don't need more safety trials. We need trials designed to answer the question, does it work? And if so, where does it work? When does it work? For who does it work? What are biomarkers that can tell us if it's going to work? And those aren't happening right now, unfortunately.
Yep. I think this is a conversation for a future episode, but you and I recently were talking to someone and they were super pro berberine, anti-metformin.
Yeah, right.
And the only reason why is because this one's
a drug,
and this one's over the counter. And I said,
actually, they're both drugs, but yeah.
In a different universe, if this one was founded first, they could have been flipped for all we know. Tylenol, if it was founded now, it could have been a pharmaceutical.
Yeah, so. And we talked about it. We should do a deep dive comparing berberine to metformin because, I think given my knowledge of the literature at this point, which is not deep on berberine, but I know a fair amount, I don't see anything to really convince me that berberine is a superior choice to metformin in terms of safety.
Hmm.
It's just sold over the counter because of the stupid way FDA regulates over-the-counter drugs.
Which is what I was trying to highlight. The polite argument is just it feels arbitrary.
It is arbitrary.
Yeah.
Well, it is arbitrary because the way that FDA regulates these things is bureaucratic and not scientific.
Last question. What are the chances that something better profile, more effective than rapamycin is hiding on an island somewhere?
100%.
That's interesting to me, and that's part of what Aura Next Door is working on.
Yeah. I mean, again, the idea that so there's a couple of reasons why I say that. First of all, I think I appreciate the extent of biology that's out there that nobody has explored, period. Not just in longevity, but period, right? So there's no question there are better things than rapamycin out there for longevity. And particularly in the longevity space, if you think about all of the possible drugs that we could test, just single drugs, not even counting two-way, three-way, four-way combinations, we have explored for longevity in any organism like a minuscule, 0.00001% of all the things that could be tested. So the idea that in that very small fraction, we would have identified the best possible drug that exists for longevity is exceedingly tiny. And then when you put combinations on top of it, it just becomes almost ridiculous. So again, maybe I should have given a precise answer of I'm 99.99999% confident. But the reality is there are definitely things out there better than there are mTOR inhibitors out there better than rapamycin. I know that because Aura's already found one, at least in nematode worms. So this is part of where I think the field has become stagnated is mostly the field has stopped exploring what's out there and become very myopic and focused on what we already know about. Yeah. And that's why I believe we aren't finding new interventions better than rapamycin or better than caloric restriction.
Yeah, and that goes back to why earlier I asked you, do you think metformin is kind of being over-researched right now? Like it just feels like that energy, like that 40-month monkey study we talked about, that energy should be applied to trying to find the next rapamycin.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a slippery slope to go down when you start criticizing individual studies and should we have spent the money on this versus other. So let me just say, I wouldn't have spent the money that way. But that doesn't mean that I would have spent the money the right way. But I know where I would put the money in this field if I had the opportunity. And I guarantee you it would be more impactful than studying metformin in monkeys. But having said that, I think metformin, one of the reasons why people, the people who would argue that we should put resources into metformin argue that is because we have a lot of data in humans already. So we already know a lot about how you would dose it in people. We know a lot about the safety profile in people. Some people will say metformin's safer than rapamycin. I actually don't think that's the case, but we do have a lot more safety data on metformin in humans. And so if metformin does, in fact, let's just say delay cognitive aging like this study suggested in metabolically healthy people, that's a big deal, and we should study it. So I'm hesitant to say that we shouldn't be studying metformin. I would just like to see the quality of research that's being done and the impact of those studies be done in a way that, again, actually gets us closer to an answer as opposed to, my interpretation of that monkey study is it didn't really answer any questions because there's an obvious alternative explanation for the results.
Would there be financial incentive for pharmaceuticals to find the next version? We've seen the stocks increase with GLP-1 agonists like Eli Lilly and whatnot. I'm assuming something that could improve lifespan of 30% or something, substantial.
I mean, I think obviously obviously if you could prove that, everybody would want it, right? So there's a huge market. But I think the challenge, and this is partly why pharmaceutical companies have not really yet engaged in geroscience, is the path to getting to approval is non-obvious, right? So you can't do a lifespan study in normally aging people, just not pragmatic. I think there are clear paths, but the people who make the decisions at the pharmaceutical companies, I don't think are there yet. And again, big companies, very conservative in their approach, cookie cutter, they're going to follow the leader. Very few are going to lead the way. So I think somebody has to do it first. But having said that, there are smaller companies now developing geroscience therapeutics, moving them into the clinical pipeline, starting to do clinical trials, mostly in humans, but also in dogs. Loyal is an example of trying to do this in dogs. So I think the endpoints are going to be different in dogs and humans. But we're starting to see those first efforts to think about like what's a really smartly designed geroscience clinical trial? What's an endpoint that we can actually get FDA approval for? Once you have FDA approval, then the company can make a decision. Do we then now go after a second endpoint? Do we just make the case that it's modulating the biology of aging? So I think we'll get there. The other thing to say about the pharmaceutical companies coming into the field is, I think with good reason, up until, 15 years ago, they weren't really interested in the longevity space because the science wasn't there yet, right? I mean, it was still pretty early. I think the science has matured enough that we now can have confidence that we can. Again, I think we could do better. I think there's a lot we don't understand, but we can modulate biology of aging in humans, and we have some therapeutics that might do that. So I think there's a lot of things that are coming together to see progress in the right direction, but it's not happening quickly.
That makes sense. Some of them might feel burnt for bad leads like resveratrol or something,
Right.
maybe.
I mean, again, I think the whole Sertris thing where Glaxo bought Sertris for some obscene amount of money and then ended up shutting the program down based on shoddy science certainly had an impact. How much impact did it have? I don't know. My guess is it set the field back 10 to 15 years in terms of pharmaceutical interest coming into the space.
Well, that's helpful. Any final thoughts on the New York Times article? Went pretty deep into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was fine. I tend to be of the mindset of under promise and over deliver. And I think this article was written in a way that understated the promise of rapamycin. So all things being even, I am more comfortable with that than an article that overhyped it. So in that way, I feel like it was fine. Again, like we already covered, I was a little disappointed in some of the statements, some of the quotes in there, but overall, I'm pretty optimistic that rapamycin can have benefits on health for a lot of people. I think we need to demonstrate it rigorously, and I think we need to know more about who, when, and how much.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the outstanding questions.
All right, Matt. Well, thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone, for watching this episode of the Optispan podcast. As always, if you've got any questions or comments, please leave them below. If you're not yet a subscriber, hit the subscribe button, and we hope to see you next time on the podcast.